You really thought that badge would save you? Deputy Mason Cole's laugh cut through the rain like a door slamming in a quiet church, sharp, public, meant to be heard by everyone watching. Red and blue light rolled across the wet street, across the polished hood of Ava Brooks's dark sedan, across the white porch columns of the expensive homes lining Juniper Hill Drive, and finally across Ava's face, calm in a way that almost made the moment feel unreal. She stood beside her car with both hands visible, her FBI credentials held carefully between two fingers, not raised too high, not moved too fast. Every motion measured the way trained people learn to move, when one wrong gesture can turn into the wrong story. The rain had started as a mist 10 minutes earlier, but now it clung to everything, to her lashes, to the sleeve of her charcoal coat, to the leather wallet holding the badge Mason refused to take seriously. From behind lace curtains and half-open front doors, neighbors watched the scene unfold from warm foyers and amber-lit kitchens, their faces pale in the glow of porch lamps, their phones already lifted. No one knew that Ava had been sitting in that parked sedan for over 40 minutes, waiting on a signal tied to an active federal operation that was supposed to stay invisible for one more hour. No one knew the black SUV 2 blocks away contained agents listening for a coded check-in. And Mason Cole, with his square jaw, pressed uniform, and smug certainty, clearly believed he knew everything he needed the second he saw a black woman alone in a quiet neighborhood after dark. His flashlight beam swept over Ava again, lingering too long, less like procedure and more like accusation. "Step away from the vehicle," he said, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from never being publicly questioned. Ava obeyed without protest. Her heels clicked once against the pavement, then stopped. She had spent years learning how to survive rooms like this, the kind where facts arrived late, but judgment arrived right on time. "Officer," she said evenly, her voice low and controlled, "my name is Ava Brooks. I'm a federal agent. My identification is in front of you." Mason tilted his head, looked at the badge, then back at her, and smiled the way men smile when they think. "Power is proof. Federal agent," he repeated, almost amused. "That's original." One of the neighbors let out a nervous laugh from a porch across the street, and something in the air changed. It was no longer a stop. It was a performance. Ava could feel it. The rain tapping on car roofs. The distant hum of tires from the boulevard half a mile away. The cold sinking through the thin sole of her shoe. The quiet calculation behind Mason's eyes as he decided who would be believed before the truth had even spoken. Still, she did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She only watched him with that same steady gaze, the one that made careless men uncomfortable because it carried no panic at all. Then Mason looked down at the badge in her hand one more time, shook his head, and said, loud enough for every porch on the block to hear, "Ma'am, you are in serious trouble." And somewhere in the dark, just beyond the curve of the street, engines began to turn the corner. The sound reached them before the vehicles did, low at first, almost swallowed by the rain, then growing louder as a line of black sport utility vehicles rolled around the bend at the end of Juniper Hill Drive and cut through the blue-red wash of Mason Cole's patrol lights. For one brief second, the whole street seemed to hold its breath. Porch conversations stopped. Screen doors stayed half open. Even the rain felt smaller, thinner, as if the night itself were listening. Ava Brooks did not turn her head right away. She kept her eyes on Mason, on the way his mouth tightened, even though he was still trying to wear that same amused expression, the same easy authority he had been using since he stepped out of his cruiser. It was slipping now. Not much, just enough for someone trained to notice. Ava noticed everything. The shift in his shoulders. The quick glance he threw toward the approaching headlights. The way his flashlight lowered an inch before he lifted it again, as if his body had reacted to something his pride had not caught up with yet. Water ran down the side of Ava's face, cool and steady, but her breathing stayed even. She had learned a long time ago that composure was not just professionalism. Sometimes it was protection. Sometimes it was the only thing another person could not take from you. Mason took one step closer, close enough to make the move look official for the neighbors recording from their front steps, and held out his hand for the credentials at last. Ava passed them over without a word. The leather was damp from the weather, but the badge inside still caught the light, a quick flash of gold against the dark. Mason looked down at it longer this time. His expression changed by degrees, not into respect, not yet, but into irritation, because uncertainty was already beginning to irritate him. "You people always think a piece of metal changes the whole story," he said, voice lower now, less for the street and more for her. Ava heard it. So did the camera in his chest. So did the cameras in the hands of 3 neighbors across the street. She did not answer the insult. She only said, very clearly, "You can verify my identification through dispatch, or you can wait 5 seconds and have it verified for you." That landed. Mason looked past her again, this time longer. The first of the black vehicles came to a smooth stop 20 feet away. Then the second. Then the third. Their doors opened with a heavy, deliberate sound that carried farther than it should have in the wet night air. Men and women in dark jackets stepped out, not rushing, not shouting, just moving with the kind of coordination that did not need drama to announce itself. One porch light flicked on across the street, brighter than the rest. A child's voice was pulled back inside by an adult whisper. Ava finally turned her head. The agents were exactly where they should have been, exactly when she knew they would be. She felt the knot in her chest loosen by half an inch, no more. Relief was dangerous if it arrived too early. One of the agents spoke quietly into an earpiece. Another scanned the line of houses. A third looked directly at Ava, gave the smallest nod, and then shifted his attention to Mason Cole. Mason squared his shoulders, trying to recover the posture he had walked in with, but the street no longer belonged to him the way it had 2 minutes earlier. Not with federal vehicles at the curb. Not with witnesses filming. Not with rain shining on the badge in his hand like a spotlight he could not turn off. Then the rear door of the lead vehicle opened, and the one person Ava had not expected to see in person that night stepped out into the rain. It was Daniel Reed. Even in the rain, even under the scattered glare of porch lights and patrol lights and the pale wash from the federal vehicles, Ava recognized the way he moved before she saw his face clearly. He stepped out without hurry, one hand closing the door behind him, dark overcoat buttoned high, silver at his temples catching a brief stripe of blue light as he looked down the street and took in the scene in one sweep. Daniel Reed was not a man who needed to raise his voice to alter the temperature of a room, or a street, or an entire investigation. The moment he appeared, the air changed. Ava felt it in the silence that spread from porch to porch. She felt it in Mason Cole too. The deputy still stood upright, still trying to hold the shape of command, but something in his posture had become effort instead of instinct. Daniel walked forward with measured steps, polished shoes darkened by rain, and stopped beside the first vehicle just long enough to glance at one of the agents holding a tablet. A few words were exchanged too low for anyone across the street to hear. Then Daniel lifted his eyes and looked directly at Ava. Not with surprise, not with concern, with recognition, with confirmation. With the calm of a man who had just found the missing piece exactly where it was supposed to be. "Agent Brooks," he said, clear enough for the entire block to hear. "Are you all right?" It was a simple question, but it landed like a document stamped official. Ava answered just as clearly. "Yes, sir." She did not add more. She did not need to. Daniel's gaze shifted to the credentials in Mason's hand. The deputy hesitated for half a second before holding them out. And that half second told Ava more than any protest would have. Men who were certain they were right did not hesitate when truth arrived. Daniel took the badge wallet, opened it once, then closed it again as if he had already known exactly what he would find. "Special Agent Ava Brooks is assigned to a federal task force operating tonight under sealed authority," he said. No anger, no theatricality, just facts, precise and cold. Rain ticked softly on the hoods of the parked vehicles. Somewhere down the block a wind chime moved once and fell still. Daniel continued. "This location is connected to an active investigation. Every unnecessary delay matters. Every public disruption matters. Every word spoken on camera matters." At that, several heads on the porches shifted. Neighbors looked from Daniel to Mason and back again, suddenly aware that what they had treated like late-night neighborhood drama was something else entirely. Ava kept her hands at her sides and said nothing. Years of fieldwork had taught her that the truth often sounded strongest after a long enough silence. Mason cleared his throat. "Sir, I was conducting a lawful stop." She identified herself after I made contact. He tried to say it firmly, but the sentence came out too polished, too prepared, as if he were already arranging it for a report. Daniel watched him for a moment that felt longer than it was. Did dispatch confirm her identity? He asked. Mason did not answer right away. Deputy, Daniel said, still calm. Did dispatch confirm her identity? Mason's jaw tightened. Not yet. Daniel gave the slightest nod, the kind a surgeon might give before making the first incision, except nothing about his expression was sharp. If anything, it was disappointed. Interesting, he said. Because we confirmed yours before we turned the corner. Ava saw it then, the first real crack in Mason Cole's confidence, small but unmistakable, and she knew the night was no longer turning. It had turned. Daniel Reed did not raise his voice, but the street leaned toward him anyway. Rain tapped softly on the roofs of the federal vehicles and slid down the windshield of Ava Brooks's sedan in silver lines that caught the patrol lights and broke them into strips of red and blue across the pavement. Juniper Hill Drive had gone so quiet that Ava could hear the faint electric hum from a porch lantern 2 houses down and the restless rustle of wet oak leaves above the mailbox at the curb. Daniel handed Ava's credentials back to her with deliberate care, as if restoring more than an identification wallet, and she took them without looking away from Mason Cole. The deputy was still trying to stand inside the shape of his authority, shoulders squared, chin lifted, one hand resting near his duty belt, even though no one around him looked impressed by the gesture anymore. Daniel glanced once at the body camera mounted on Mason's chest, then at the phone still raised across the street. For the record, he said, each word clean and measured. This contact interrupted a sealed federal surveillance window. A murmur moved through the porches, not loud, just enough to show that the neighbors understood the phrase federal surveillance even if they did not understand the full meaning behind it. Mason shifted his weight. Sir, with respect, I responded to a suspicious vehicle complaint in a residential zone after dark. He said it carefully, placing the words one after another like boards over a hole he hoped no one would notice beneath him. Daniel did not blink. And once Agent Brooks identified herself, Mason looked at Ava, then back at Daniel. I still had an obligation to verify. Verification is not the issue, Daniel replied. Sequence is. The sentence landed harder because it was so calm. Ava felt it move through Mason like cold water through glass. For the first time that night, his expression lost its polish. It did not collapse. Men like him rarely collapsed in public. But the edges loosened. The confidence turned defensive. The performance turned procedural. Daniel took one slow step closer, not threatening, not dramatic, just close enough that Mason had to either meet his eyes or look away. Dispatch logs are being pulled, Daniel said. Body camera footage is being preserved. Witness recordings are already in circulation. So this is the moment to be precise. The rain thickened for a few seconds, stippling the hood of the cruiser and darkening the shoulders of Mason's uniform. Ava stood still, one hand wrapped around the badge wallet, feeling the damp leather warm slowly against her palm. She knew Daniel well enough to hear what he was doing beneath the surface of his words. He was not just correcting a deputy. He was laying out a chain. Time. Action. Evidence. Witnesses. He was building the structure that truth could stand on when emotion finally burned off. One of the agents near the lead vehicle spoke quietly into a radio and received an answer that made him look toward Daniel at once. Daniel extended his hand, and the agent passed over a phone-sized tablet sealed in a black case. Porch lights reflected across the glass as Daniel read. Ava watched his face stay almost perfectly neutral, but she saw the subtle change in his eyes, the narrowing that meant confirmation had arrived. Deputy Cole, he said, dispatch did not classify this vehicle as a threat. The caller reported a parked sedan and a woman sitting inside it. Across the street, someone lowered a phone in visible embarrassment, as if realizing how small the original complaint had sounded now that it was said out loud. Mason opened his mouth, then closed it. Daniel continued. At 19 seconds into your recorded contact, Agent Brooks identified herself. At 34 seconds, she offered credentials. At 48 seconds, you dismissed those credentials verbally before verification was attempted. The night seemed to tighten around that sequence. Numbers had a way of stripping excuses down to bone. Mason's face changed color under the wash of the lights, not by much, but enough for the watching porches to notice. Ava could feel every eye on the block moving between the two men and then landing, again and again, on her. Not because she had demanded attention, because she had endured it long enough for the truth to arrive. Daniel handed the tablet back to the agent. You did not encounter uncertainty and manage it professionally, he said. You encountered a black federal agent and decided what she could not be before the facts were in your hand. No one on the porches laughed now. No one whispered. Even the rain seemed to soften. Mason drew a breath through his nose, slow and controlled, the kind of breath people take when they realize the story they were telling has stopped belonging to them. Ava looked at him and saw it fully at last, the thing that had been hidden under the badge, the uniform, the smug smile, the easy suspicion. Fear. Not fear of danger. Fear of consequence. And on a street that had started the night with him certain he could define her in a glance, that felt like the first real shift toward justice. For a long moment, nobody moved. The rain kept falling in a fine, steady curtain, silver under the porch lights, soft against the black hoods of the federal vehicles, soft against the windshield of the cruiser that had arrived on this street like a declaration and now sat there looking smaller somehow, its light bar still spinning across wet brick, clipped hedges, and white-painted railings. Ava Brooks stood exactly where she had been standing, shoulders relaxed, badge wallet warm in her hand now, though everything else around her felt cold. She could feel the eyes from the porches, from the half-open front doors, from behind the glowing windows of homes that had probably never expected to become part of a federal record on a Thursday night. She had spent years inside moments like this, moments when the room or the street or the office changed not because people suddenly became better, but because facts arrived in a form they could not ignore. Daniel Reed let the silence do its work before he spoke again. Deputy Cole, he said, and even Mason's name sounded different in his voice, stripped of local swagger, reduced to a line item in a much larger system. This stop is now part of a documented federal incident review. Mason swallowed, quick enough that only someone watching closely would notice. Ava noticed. She had been watching men like him her entire career, men who mistook being questioned for being disrespected, men who treated certainty like evidence, men who looked at a black woman in a dark sedan on an expensive street and decided the category before they considered the facts. Mason lifted his chin as if posture alone could still save him. Sir, I followed protocol based on the information I had. Daniel turned his head slightly, rain collecting at the edge of his collar, and asked, which protocol permits ridicule after identification is presented? Mason did not answer. The question lingered there in the wet night air, simple and plain and impossible to smooth over with tone. Across the street, one of the neighbors lowered her phone completely. Another took a half step back into the warmth of his foyer, as if shame had finally found him. Ava could smell rainwater, damp cedar mulch, and the faint, bitter trace of coffee drifting from somewhere inside one of the houses. Ordinary things. Domestic things. That was what always made nights like this feel so sharp. Harm never arrived in a dramatic place. It arrived beside trimmed lawns and decorative lanterns and flags hanging neatly from porch beams. Daniel extended a hand, and one of the agents stepped forward with a clear evidence pouch. Body camera copy request is active, the agent said. Dispatch audio is secured. Residential recordings are being flagged for intake. The words were procedural, but they changed everything. They made the moment permanent. Mason looked from the pouch to Daniel to Ava, and for the first time the street saw him without the shelter of his own confidence. He was not towering now. He was calculating. He was listening to the machinery of accountability start around him. This is unnecessary, he said, though the strength had gone out of the sentence before it even ended. Daniel's expression did not change. What was unnecessary, he replied, was escalating suspicion after lawful identification in front of witnesses during a sealed operation. Ava felt the sentence settle over the block like a final layer of rain. It did not shout. It did not accuse in some theatrical way. It simply named what had happened, and naming was powerful. Naming was often the first real form of justice. Mason's hand drifted away from his belt and fell to his side. One of the agents near the lead vehicle spoke quietly into his radio, listened, then nodded toward Daniel. Internal Affairs Liaison is aware, he said. County Supervisor has been notified. The words passed through the street like an invisible current. Porch faces changed again. People who had watched for entertainment were now watching history rearrange itself in real time. Ava did not smile. She did not need to. This was not victory yet. It was only the point where denial stopped being possible. Daniel stepped closer to Mason, close enough now that the deputy had to look directly at him. "You are being instructed not to leave this location," he said. "Your statements from this point forward are being noted." Mason's lips parted, but no words came. The blue light rolled over his face, then red, then blue again, turning his silence into something almost physical. Ava looked at him and remembered the laugh from minutes earlier, the easy disbelief, the way he had tried to make her identity sound like a joke for the benefit of the people watching. That was how it always began. Not with facts. With permission. Permission to doubt her first. Permission to diminish her first. Permission to make her prove she belonged in spaces white men entered without explanation. But the street was different now. The same phones that had framed her as suspicious were framing him as accountable. The same porch lights that had exposed her were now exposing the cost of underestimating her. Rain slid from the edge of Ava's jaw and dropped onto the pavement. She did not wipe it away. Daniel turned slightly, and when he spoke next, his voice carried just enough to reach every porch on the block. "Agent Brooks," he said, "you will provide your statement once the scene is secured." Ava met his eyes. "Yes, sir." The answer came steady, almost gentle. That steadiness seemed to unsettle Mason more than anything else. Not anger, not triumph. Steadiness. Because it reminded everyone watching that she had never lost control of herself, even when the night had tried to take that from her. Then one more vehicle turned onto Juniper Hill Drive, slower than the others, marked county, official, unmistakable, and the expression on Mason Cole's face changed again, this time not into fear alone, but into recognition. He finally understood that this was no longer about a misunderstanding on a quiet street. This was the beginning of the part that would follow him home. The county sedan stopped beneath the dripping maple at the edge of the curb, its headlights washing across the wet lawn and the polished mailbox numbers in a pale white beam that made everything look colder, cleaner, harder to deny. The driver stepped out first, then a second figure from the passenger side, both in dark county jackets with clipped movements and the tired, alert faces of people pulled into a situation already turning larger than whatever brief summary had reached them over the radio. Ava Brooks watched without moving, rain gathering at the ends of her hair and slipping down the collar of her coat, the damp fabric settling heavier against her shoulders with each passing second. She could feel the night slowing down around her now, no longer spinning on shock, no longer feeding on Mason Cole's earlier confidence, but settling into something more dangerous for him than chaos. Order, procedure, review. The words did not sound dramatic when spoken aloud, but Ava had spent enough years inside federal work to know that quiet systems could do what loud men could not. Daniel Reed turned toward the arriving county officials and gave a short nod. No handshakes. No wasted introductions. One of the men approached, mid-50s maybe, broad in the shoulders, rain already darkening the brim of his cap. He looked first at Daniel, then at Ava, then finally at Mason, and the look he gave the deputy was not confusion. It was the look of someone arriving late and realizing the facts had already chosen a side. "County Watch Commander Elias Turner," he said, voice low and even. "I was told there was a field dispute involving a federal agent." Daniel answered with the same measured calm he had used all night. "There was an unlawful escalation during a sealed surveillance operation. Identification was presented. Verification was not properly pursued before public commentary and scene disruption occurred. Evidence is preserved." Turner's eyes shifted to Ava again. "Agent Brooks, are you injured?" "No, sir," she said. Her voice came out steady, almost softer than the rain itself. Turner nodded once, as if that answer mattered to him in a way procedure alone could not capture. Then he turned back to Mason. "Deputy, remove yourself from the center of the scene and remain available." It was not a shouted command. It did not need to be. Mason obeyed, but only after a pause long enough for every porch on Juniper Hill Drive to feel it. Ava saw the hesitation, the instinct to resist, the old habit of believing his badge should buy him one more inch of control. It did not. He stepped aside at last, shoes dark with rain, jaw set so tightly it changed the shape of his face. The neighbors were still watching, not with the same curiosity as before. The atmosphere had changed too much for that. Some now looked embarrassed. Some looked fixed in place by the discomfort of seeing a story they thought they understood reveal what it had really been carrying all along. On one porch, a woman wrapped a cardigan tighter around herself and lowered her phone, not because the scene was over, but because it had become something too real to treat casually. Ava noticed these small things because small things were often where truth lived. Not in speeches, not in headlines, in hands lowering, in mouths going quiet, in men of authority arriving and no longer protecting the first version of events simply because it was convenient. Daniel asked one of the agents for an umbrella. The agent offered it toward Ava, but she shook her head once. The rain was cold, yes, but it kept her present. It reminded her where she was, what this street smelled like, what the porch lights looked like reflected in puddles the size of dinner plates along the curb. Wet cedar, motor oil, the faint sweetness of night-blooming shrubs from somebody's front walk, the metallic hush that comes after power shifts, and everyone senses it before they can describe it. Daniel did not insist about the umbrella. He simply said, "Your statement can wait 2 more minutes." Ava understood what he meant. Not urgency. Space. A moment to breathe before the machinery continued. That kindness, small and practical, nearly reached deeper than all the formal respect that had arrived with the federal vehicles. She drew a slow breath and let it out. Across the street, one of the children who had been pulled inside earlier peeked from behind a curtain, only half visible in the yellow light of the living room. Ava wondered what the child saw. A black woman standing in the rain with her back straight. Men with badges no longer speaking over her. A deputy no longer in charge of the story he had started. Maybe that was enough for one night. Maybe that was how change entered a neighborhood, not with applause, but with a single image that refused to go away. Turner conferred quietly with Daniel for less than a minute, then signaled to one of his own officers near the county sedan. Papers were not exchanged yet. No one rushed. But the posture of the county team had already shifted into formal review, and Mason knew it. Ava could see it in the way he stared at nothing for a moment too long, as if trying to calculate how a night that began with certainty had become a record that would outlast him. Rain drummed softly on the roof of the cruiser. The light bar kept turning, red to blue, blue to red, but it no longer looked like command. It looked like evidence. Ava lowered her eyes to the badge wallet in her hand and brushed a thumb across the edge of the leather. Simple motion. Grounding motion. When she looked up again, Daniel was watching the block. Not just the officers, not just the cars, but the homes, the witnesses, the silence between. All of it. "It is the quiet part people remember," he said, not loudly, not really to anyone in particular. Ava heard him anyway. He was right. People remembered the raised voice for a day. They remembered the silence after the truth for years. And standing there under the rain, while Juniper Hill Drive listened to its own heartbeat, Ava understood that the night had entered that quieter place now, the place where consequence no longer needed to announce itself because everyone could already feel it coming. Watch Commander Elias Turner receive the update through his earpiece first, and Ava Brooks saw the change pass across his face before he said a single word. It was small, almost invisible, just a tightening around the eyes, a brief stillness in the mouth. The look of a man who had expected trouble and had just learned it ran deeper than the curbside scene in front of him. Rain slid from the brim of his cap and tapped against the shoulder of his county jacket as he turned slightly toward Daniel Reed. "We have a confirmation from Internal Affairs," he said, keeping his voice low, but not low enough to hide the weight of it from the officers standing closest. Deputy Cole was already listed in a pending review connected to selective stops in this district. The words did not explode. They settled. That was worse. Ava felt them move across Juniper Hill Drive like a shift in air pressure before a storm breaks. Daniel did not react with surprise. He only asked, "Related to conduct or reporting?" Turner answered without looking away. "Both." For the first time all night, Mason Cole seemed to forget the neighbors, the phones, the patrol lights, the wet street reflecting every color back at him. His face lost that last stubborn layer of official calm and showed something rawer underneath. Not confession, not regret, but the unmistakable shock of a man discovering that the night was no longer an isolated mistake. It was a pattern catching up with him. Ava stood still, rain cooling her skin, badge wallet resting against her palm like a quiet reminder of everything she had worked for, everything men like Mason had doubted on sight. Across the street, a porch light flickered once and steadied. A woman in slippers stepped out one pace farther than before, no phone in her hand now. Only her arms folded tight across her chest as she listened. Turner continued, and each sentence sounded more final than the one before it. 3 complaints over 11 months. 2 were dismissed for insufficient corroboration. 1 remains open. The reporting language is consistent. Mason drew a breath as if to interrupt, but Daniel lifted one hand just enough to stop him without ever touching him. "Do not speak over this," Daniel said. The sentence was quiet, but it landed with complete authority. Ava looked at Mason and saw something she had seen before in conference rooms, in lobbies, in secure hallways, in every place where black competence had been met first with suspicion and then, when the facts arrived, with panic. It was the panic of someone who had never imagined documentation would matter this much. One of the federal agents approached with a second tablet, its screen glowing pale against the rain-dark street. "Sir," the agent said to Daniel, "the field team recovered the timestamp from Agent Brooks's surveillance log. Her position here was approved 39 minutes before County Dispatch received the neighborhood call." Daniel accepted the tablet and glanced at the screen, then handed it to Turner. "Which means," Daniel said, "the federal presence existed first. The suspicion came later." Turner read the screen, jaw set, then looked up at Mason with a level stare that carried no room for interpretation. "You understand what that means for your narrative, Deputy?" Mason tried once more to stand inside procedure. "Commander, I was responding to a resident concern." "No," Turner said, and that one word was the first truly hard thing anyone had spoken all night. "You were responding to your assumptions." Silence rushed in right after it. Not empty silence. Full silence. The kind that presses against windows and sits in the throat of every witness. Ava felt it all around her. The houses, the dripping trees, the federal jackets darkened by rain, the cruiser lights turning and turning, no longer symbols of control, just spinning color against the truth. Somewhere behind one of the doors, a television continued playing faintly. A laugh track from some late show drifting out into a street that no longer belonged to ordinary Thursday night routines. Turner handed the tablet back and spoke in the flat tone of someone now thinking several steps ahead. "Deputy Cole, pending immediate review, your field authority is suspended at this scene. Surrender your active incident documentation and step back." Mason did not move at first. Ava could almost hear the struggle inside him, the old reflex telling him to resist, to explain, to defend himself with tone and posture and rank. But the structure around him had changed. County, federal, witnesses, logs, prior complaints, timestamps. Nothing theatrical, nothing exaggerated. Just layer after layer of reality placed where pride could no longer climb over it. He finally reached for his notepad and passed it over, the motion stiff and reluctant, and that simple act felt larger than it should have, because it was the first visible sign to everyone watching that his power had limits after all. Ava did not feel triumph. Not exactly. What she felt was older than triumph, steadier than anger. Recognition. The same system that had failed to protect dignity in the first minute was now being forced, piece by piece, to acknowledge the person it had tried to reduce. Daniel turned toward her then, and in his eyes she saw the unspoken truth of the moment. This was the turn. Not the end, but the turn. The place where the story stopped asking who would be believed and started showing what belief cost when it arrived too late. Rain traced a cold line down Ava's wrist. She closed her fingers around the badge wallet and lifted her chin a fraction. Across Juniper Hill Drive, every porch had gone still. No one was laughing now. No one was recording for entertainment anymore. They were watching consequence take shape in real time, and for the first time that night, Mason Cole understood that the thing closing in around him was not embarrassment. It was history with a file number. The rain eased without fully stopping, as if the night itself wanted to hear the next part clearly. Water still slipped from the oak leaves and ran along the curb in thin silver streams, carrying reflections of red, blue, and white down the slope of Juniper Hill Drive like the street had become a mirror that could not stop replaying what had happened on it. Ava Brooks stood with her coat damp and heavy at the shoulders, her badge wallet secure in her hand, her breathing even now, though the air still felt charged enough to hum. She watched Commander Elias Turner pass. Mason Cole's notepad to another county officer watched Daniel Reed speak quietly with a federal agent at the hood of the lead vehicle. Watched the neighbors hold themselves in a silence far different from the one that had opened the night. This silence had weight. It had memory. It had shame in it. It had recognition in it. Mason no longer looked like a man trying to control a scene. He looked like a man trying to stay upright inside a reality that had changed its terms without asking his permission. His shoulders had lost their edge. The lines around his mouth had tightened into something dry and strained. Rain dotted the front of his uniform and gathered at the seam of his collar, but he did not brush it away. He seemed to understand, finally, that appearances had stopped helping him several minutes ago. Turner stepped back in front of him and spoke in the flat, official tone used when a decision has already crossed from discussion into record. Deputy Cole, pending review by County Internal Affairs and in coordination with federal documentation already secured tonight, you are relieved of active field status effective immediately. The words settled over the block with almost no sound at all, yet Ava felt them more deeply than any raised voice could have reached. A porch door clicked shut somewhere down the street. A phone screen dimmed. One of the women watching from across the road lowered her head for a second, as if embarrassed by how quickly she had accepted the first version of the story. Turner continued, "Your patrol vehicle will remain on site. Another officer will handle your report access. From this point forward, you do not direct this scene." Mason opened his mouth, then stopped. Ava saw the instinct to argue rise in him and fail before it reached his lips. Daniel stepped closer then, not to dominate, not to humiliate, but to make one thing unmistakably clear. "Agent Brooks identified herself," he said. "She remained professional. She gave you every lawful opportunity to correct your approach. You chose not to. No anger. Just truth. That made it sharper." Mason looked at Ava then, truly looked at her for what felt like the first time all night. Not as a silhouette in a parked sedan. Not as an interruption. Not as a suspicion. As a woman he had misjudged. In public, on camera, in front of witnesses, while standing inside a pattern already under review. Whatever he expected to find in her face, he did not find triumph. Ava gave him nothing cruel. Nothing theatrical. Only steadiness. And somehow that seemed harder for him to bear than outrage would have been. The county officer beside Turner stepped forward with paperwork on a weatherproof clipboard and began reading the next procedural steps in a voice too low for the porches to catch every word, but loud enough for the meaning to travel. Administrative hold. Review. Recorded statements. Preservation of evidence. Ava could almost feel the phrases locking into place one by one. The machinery of accountability moving with its slow, unspectacular precision. This was what many people never understood about justice. It was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived as paperwork in the rain. Sometimes it sounded like calm voices and exact language, and a man being told that the authority he wore was no longer his to use. Turner accepted Mason's department phone and handed it off. Another officer took possession of his cruiser keys. Each small act seemed to strip away a layer of certainty that Mason had carried onto the street with him. The neighbors could see it too. Their faces had changed again, no longer tense with curiosity, but sober now, unsettled by the plain fact that the black woman they had watched from behind warm windows had been the one telling the truth from the beginning. Ava felt the cold in her sleeves and the damp at the back of her neck, but beneath that she felt something else, something quieter and stronger. Not satisfaction. Not relief. Something closer to balance being restored inch by inch. Daniel turned to her and softened, only slightly. "Agent Brooks," he said, "your presence of mind protected more than this operation tonight." Ava held his gaze. She knew what he meant. Evidence. Procedure. Dignity. Maybe even the next person who might have met Mason Cole on another street under another set of lights. She answered simply, "I did my job." Turner heard it and looked at her for a long second before giving one small nod, the kind that contained respect without display. Mason lowered his eyes then, not dramatically, just enough for everyone to understand that the center of gravity had shifted for good. The rain moved softer. Now, almost like mist, and in that softer weather the whole block seemed to exhale at once. Juniper Hill Drive had begun the night with suspicion pointed in the wrong direction. Now it stood under porch lights and patrol lights and federal headlights, watching the wrong man answer for the story he had tried to write about someone else. The last of the official voices faded into the rain, and what remained on Juniper Hill Drive was not chaos, not triumph, not even argument, but the strange, unmistakable quiet that comes when a false story finally runs out of room. Ava Brooks stood near the curb for one more moment, her coat still damp, her hair touched with rain, her badge wallet resting secure in her hand, as if it had been returned not only to her pocket, but to its proper meaning. Around her, the street looked almost ordinary again. Porch lights glowed warm behind glass. Water slipped from gutter edges in steady drops. The wet pavement reflected the red and blue sweep from the patrol vehicle in long trembling lines that stretched and broke and gathered again in the shallow water near the storm drain. But ordinary was no longer possible, not after what this block had seen, not after what had been named aloud. Daniel Reed was speaking with the county team now, quiet and composed, already turning the night into what it would become by morning. Reports, preserved footage, signed statements, a sequence of facts too exact to be softened later. Watch Commander Elias Turner stood nearby, shoulders squared against the weather, his presence steady and unsentimental, as if he understood that dignity was sometimes protected not by grand gestures, but by refusing to look away when the truth became inconvenient. Mason Cole remained off to the side, no longer at the center of anything, his silence heavier than any defense he might have offered. Ava did not look at him again for long. She did not need to. The night had already done what it needed to do. Across the street, one of the front doors opened slowly, and the woman who had earlier watched with her phone still in hand stepped out onto her porch, not filming now, just standing there in the yellow light with a face that carried the weight of reconsideration. A man farther down the block removed his cap and held it against his chest for a second before stepping back inside. Curtains moved, hands lowered. The neighborhood was settling, but not back into the same shape. Ava had seen that before too. People like to imagine justice as a loud thing, a final thing, a single dramatic instant everyone could point to and agree upon. But most of the time it arrived more quietly than that. It arrived in records, in witnesses, in the loss of certainty on the wrong face, in the refusal of a woman to bend herself into a story someone else had written for her. She slipped the badge wallet into the inside pocket of her coat and felt the familiar weight settle near her heart. The gesture was small, almost private, but it steadied something inside her. For all the uniforms and vehicles and official language, this had never been only about procedure. It had been about being seen clearly in a place that had tried, for one dangerous stretch of time, to see her through the oldest lie in the country. Daniel turned toward her then, the rain silvering the shoulders of his coat. "Agent Brooks," he said, his voice low now that the work of public correction was done. "The field team can take it from here." Ava nodded once. Understood. He studied her for half a beat, as if considering whether to say more, then simply stepped aside and let the path to her sedan open. It was a small act, but she understood it for what it was. Respect without performance. Trust without spectacle. Ava walked toward the car at an even pace, her shoes making soft sounds against the wet asphalt, her reflection moving with her in the black shine of the road. The street watched her go, but the gaze felt different now. Not suspicion, not curiosity, something quieter, something closer to reckoning. She reached the driver's door, paused, and rested her hand lightly on the cool metal for a second. Rain tapped the roof above her fingers. Somewhere behind her, a car door shut. Somewhere else, a radio murmured and went still. The whole block seemed to breathe in slow motion. Ava looked once at the windshield, at the beads of water gathering and sliding down the glass, at the fractured reflections of porch lights trembling there like distant stars. Then she opened the door and stopped. Just for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to feel the silence fully before leaving it behind. It felt different from the silence at the beginning of the night. That earlier silence had been full of assumption. This one was full of knowledge. That earlier silence had tried to box her in. This one made room. She got into the car, closed the door softly, and sat with both hands resting on the wheel while the rain whispered over the roof. Through the windshield, Juniper Hill Drive looked washed clean and not clean at all, because some things did not disappear when the weather passed. Some things stayed in the memory of a street, in the conscience of a witness, in the record of a file, in the image of a black woman standing steady under porch lights while the truth slowly turned in her favor. Ava started the engine. The dashboard came alive in a muted glow. She did not look back in the mirror. She did not need to see who was still watching. She already knew. With the wipers brushing a clear path across the glass, she eased away from the curb and drove down the gentle curve of Juniper Hill Drive, past trimmed lawns and rain-dark trees, and the homes that would remember this night long after the water dried. Behind her, the lights continued to flash against the pavement, but they no longer looked like power. They looked like a lesson, turning over and over in the dark until everyone had no choice but to see it.